James's appearance beside Diep changed everything. In that single moment, all the walls Mr. Hoan had built, pride, prejudice, and unspoken rules, collapsed without warning. What he witnessed was not defiance, but devotion, not rebellion, but a love strong enough to cross every boundary he believed unbreakable. And as James stood firmly at Diep's side, Mr. Hoan realized that some bonds are not meant to be controlled. They are meant to be respected. No one had expected James to come that day, least of all Mr. Hoan. The afternoon had begun like so many others in Mr. Hoan's carefully ordered life. The tea on the table was still warm, the house quiet except for the distant hum of traffic and the ticking clock that had witnessed decades of his decisions. This was his world, predictable, controlled, built on rules he believed kept chaos away. People arrived when they were invited, people spoke when they were permitted, and people, especially his son, knew where they belonged. Then the door opened. At first, Mr. Hoan only saw James. His son stood there, taller than he remembered, shoulders squared not in defiance but in resolve. For a brief moment, Mr. Hoan felt a flicker of relief. Perhaps James had finally come alone, ready to listen, ready to return to the path that had been prepared for him long ago. That fragile hope lasted less than a heartbeat, because James did not step inside alone. Diep stood beside him. She did not push forward, nor did she hide behind James. She stood quietly, hands clasped, eyes steady, carrying a calm that felt strangely out of place in that tense doorway. Her presence was soft, but unmistakable, like sunlight slipping through a crack in a wall that had been sealed for years. The room changed. Mr. Hoan felt it before he understood it. Conversations stopped. The air grew heavy, as if the house itself was holding its breath. This was not supposed to happen. Not here, not now, not like this. James had crossed a line Mr. Hoan had drawn long ago, a boundary built from pride, fear, and the belief that love should obey reason. "Father," James said at last, his voice steady but low, the kind of voice a man uses when he knows every word matters. "I came as I am." Those 4 words landed harder than any argument. Mr. Hoan's gaze shifted slowly to Diep. In her he saw everything he had tried to keep separate from his son's future: simplicity, vulnerability, a life not measured by status or wealth. Yet there was no apology in her eyes, only sincerity, only presence. In that moment, memories stirred uninvited. The countless times he himself had stood outside closed doors, choosing safety over truth, silence over honesty. He had believed boundaries protected people, but now, watching James stand unflinching beside Diep, he felt something crack. This was not a rebellion, this was a declaration. And though Mr. Hoan had not yet spoken, something irreversible had already begun. The boundaries he trusted so deeply had been challenged, not with anger, but with love. Silence fell like a heavy curtain after James's words, the kind of silence that presses against the chest and makes even breathing feel too loud. Mr. Hoan did not ask them to sit, he did not tell them to leave. He simply stared, as if hoping this moment would undo itself if he waited long enough. Outside, life continued without pause. A motorbike passed by. Somewhere, a neighbor laughed. The ordinary sounds of the day felt almost cruel, reminding them that the world did not stop just because a family stood at the edge of breaking. James shifted his weight slightly, but he did not step away from Diep. That small choice spoke volumes. In everyday life, people often think loyalty is shown in grand gestures, in loud arguments, in dramatic sacrifices. But here, loyalty lived in something quieter, in staying still, in not retreating, in choosing to remain. Mr. Hoan finally spoke, his voice sharp, controlled. "Do you know what you are doing?" The question was not only for James, it cut through Diep as well. She felt it, the weight of being seen not as a person, but as a disruption.
Yet she did not lower her eyes. She had learned, through years of small struggles and patient waiting, that dignity did not need permission. "I know," James replied. "I know exactly what I'm doing." Those words unsettled Mr. Hoan more than anger ever could. This was not the reckless son he had scolded, not the boy who could be pushed back into line. This was a man who had lived without comfort, who had tasted absence, and chosen love anyway.
Mr. Hoan's thoughts raced, colliding with memories he had buried. He remembered his own youth, the woman he once loved but never fought for, the life he abandoned because it did not fit the image of success. He had told himself it was necessary, sensible, responsible. But now, standing before James and Diep, that old certainty began to tremble. "Love does not feed you," Mr. Hoan said coldly. "It does not protect you." Diep's hands tightened, but she spoke softly. "No, sir, but it teaches us how to endure." Her voice was calm, almost fragile, yet it carried a strength that surprised even James. It was the kind of strength people recognize from daily life, from mothers who wake before dawn, from workers who smile through exhaustion, from hearts that break and still choose to hope. Mr. Hoan looked away. In that moment, the real battle revealed itself. It was not between father and son, nor between wealth and simplicity. It was between fear and truth, between a lifetime of walls and a single honest step beyond them. And though no decision had been spoken, something in Mr. Hoan had already begun to shift, slowly, painfully, like ice starting to crack under the first warmth of spring. That night, the house did not sleep. The lights were turned off early, yet shadows lingered in every corner, clinging to the walls like unfinished sentences. Outside, the wind moved gently through the trees, carrying with it the ordinary sounds of life: motorbikes passing, a distant radio playing an old love song, a dog barking at nothing. These familiar noises only made the silence inside feel heavier. Mr. Hoan sat alone in his study, staring at a framed photograph on his desk. It was old, the edges worn, the colors fading. In it, he was younger, standing beside a woman whose smile once softened his hardest days. He had not said her name aloud in years, but tonight it surfaced uninvited. Love, he realized, had once stood in front of him just as boldly as Diep had stood earlier that day. In another room, James lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Every crack above him seemed to form a question. Had he gone too far? Had he just sealed his fate? He thought of Diep's hands, always rough from work, always warm. He thought of how ordinary moments with her felt extraordinary: eating simple meals, walking home at dusk, helping a child practice letters. These were not grand dreams, yet they were real, and real things, he knew, were worth defending. Diep, meanwhile, sat by a small window, watching the moonlight spill onto the yard. She replayed Mr. Hoan's expression again and again, searching for meaning. She was no stranger to being judged. Life had trained her to endure quiet rejection. Still, tonight felt different. This time, it wasn't just her heart at stake, but James's future too. She whispered to herself, "If loving him costs something, I can bear it." It was not bravery born from pride, but from everyday resilience, the kind people carry silently as they raise children, pay bills, and keep moving forward despite disappointment. Near midnight, footsteps echoed softly in the hallway. Mr. Hoan paused outside James's door, his hand hovering in the air. He remembered being a father before he became a man of power, holding a small child, promising protection without conditions. Somewhere along the way, those promises had turned into rules. He did not knock, not yet, but standing there, he felt the first real crack in the armor he had worn for decades. Sometimes, change does not arrive with loud declarations. Sometimes it comes as a restless night, a memory that refuses to fade, or the quiet realization that control cannot replace connection. As dawn approached,
None of them knew what the morning would bring. But one truth had already settled in the dark. The walls between them were no longer solid. And once cracks appear, even the strongest barriers can never be the same again.
Morning arrived quietly, as if afraid to disturb the fragile truth formed during the night. The sky was pale, almost hesitant, and the air carried the scent of wet soil and boiling rice, small, familiar signs of a new day. Life, indifferent to human conflicts, moved on. Somewhere nearby, a child laughed, a broom swept the yard, a kettle whistled softly. These ordinary sounds reminded everyone in the house that no matter how heavy the heart, the world still expects you to wake up and continue. Diep rose first. She tied her hair back, washed her face, and stood still for a moment, looking at her reflection. There was tiredness in her eyes, but also something steady, and unspoken decision. She knew that love, if real, could not hide forever. It had to stand in the open, even if it trembled. James joined her in the kitchen. Their eyes met, and in that brief silence, words became unnecessary. He reached for her hand, not tightly, not dramatically, but with the quiet certainty of someone choosing truth over comfort. That simple gesture felt heavier than any promise. When Mr. Hoan entered the room, time seemed to slow. He observed them together, not defiant, not theatrical, just real. The way James leaned slightly toward Diep, the way Diep instinctively stepped closer to James. It was in these small, unplanned movements that he saw what he had long ignored. "You're still here," he said, his voice firm but no longer sharp. "Yes," James replied, "because running would be easier, and I don't want easy anymore."
The words landed softly, yet they echoed. Mr. Hoan turned away, staring out the window at the narrow road leading into the village, the same road he had once walked on, barefoot, chasing dreams bigger than his fear. He finally understood. The boundaries he built were meant to protect, but they had slowly become walls. "I don't promise approval," he said after a long pause, "but I won't stand in the way of something I don't fully understand yet." It was not forgiveness, it was not blessing, but it was a beginning. Diep bowed her head slightly, not in submission, but in respect. She had learned long ago that acceptance does not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it arrives as space, sometimes as silence without hostility. As the sun climbed higher, light filled the room, revealing faces still uncertain, still wounded, yet no longer divided by denial. Outside, life continued. People selling vegetables, children going to school, hearts breaking and healing all at once. And in that ordinary morning, something extraordinary happened. Love was not chosen because it was easy, but because it was honest. And that, perhaps, was enough to start crossing every boundary that once seemed unbreakable.